Hello, friend. Have you ever thought about the significance of landscapes in a fantasy story? Why should you care about landscapes when writing African fantasy? Landscapes can make or break the plot of a fantasy story. Part of the reason why you are impressed with Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy is that he chose locations that immersed you into the story. You are convinced that indeed such a story could take place in such a location if the world we lived in was magical. Admit it. You could have lost interest in The Hobbits if Peter Jackson shot scenes in a studio somewhere in Los Angeles instead of the lush landscapes of New Zealand. Why did you buy into the story of Skyrim, the video game? You did because of the massive open world full of mountains, rivers, and even a few lakes. The landscape is a character in any story. It sleeps, it wakes, it dreams, and it laughs. Why are landscapes so crucial for a fantasy narrative? And can you use European landscapes to tell an African fantasy tale? Let us explore this topic together. But first, we need to ask ourselves a question. What is a landscape? A landscape, in simple terms, is the physical environment in which a story takes place. It's not really a setting, because a story setting also includes the time or period in which the story takes place. A landscape is the mountains, the valleys, the rivers, the canyons, the ridges, the lakes and oceans, and so on. A landscape can also include the architecture in your fantasy story. Landscapes are like a stage where a play is acted. If the stage is empty with a dark backdrop, the audience may not appreciate the story's depth. But when you include props in the stage, everything becomes exciting and immersive. You see, the landscape adds depth, atmosphere, and thematic richness to a fantasy story. For example, Ian Green, the author of The Gauntlet and The Feast Beneath, says in a recent published interview that, and I quote, he used the rugged physicality, weather, and the naming conventions of the Scottish landscape to make his world feel believable. He states in a separate interview that in terms of world building, he did not want to do your standard medieval European fantasy world like Britain. He wanted the geography and climate of Scotland to feature in his story and affect the plot. He wanted it to be a unique world. So, if Green must use Scottish landscapes for believability, then African fantasy writers must use African landscape for the same reason. Can you imagine setting your African fantasy in an arboreal forest full of fir, spruce, and pine trees, instead of a grassy African savanna, misty forest, or a mahogany-filled tropical jungle? Think about it. When you imagine a fantasy story set in a European arboreal forest, you visualize a marginal and ambiguous realm midway between human and fairyland. You think about forest filled with magical beasts, witches, strange buildings, and heathen gods, such as in the ancient story called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This was the story that inspired the movie The Green Knight. In The Green Knight, the protagonist, Gawain, goes on a journey into a forest after accepting a challenge from a strange being at a royal banquet. In much of the story, Gawain finds himself in a constant state of dreaming when he enters the forest and starts encountering magical phenomena. In The Lord of the Rings, the dark, mysterious Mirkwood forest is contrasted with the ethereal Lothlorien inhabited by elves. Those two examples show the significance of European forests in European fantasy. African forests also have spiritual significance. Some forests are too dark to venture into, while others are guarded by gods and spirits. In African mythology, creatures that lurk among the trees may be evil or not evil depending on the protagonist who encounters them. Forests inhabited by gods act as shrines or natural temples where sacrifices are made or libations are poured. For example, Among the Mijikenda of Kenya, there used to be kayas, or fortified villages built in the middle of a sacred forest. Villagers in Kaya revered and took care of the forest because it was sacred. This UNESCO recognized tradition continues even today. The forest is the sacred abode of their ancestors, which is why they build shrines all over the forest that honor their ancestors. One key thing about African mythology is that nature and culture are not often seen as separate. Nature is the abode of the gods, and humans are in constant communication with the gods. This means that people are always in fellowship or in unity with the nature around them. They live with nature, not against it. But when you look at the city of Minas Tirith in The Lord of the Rings, there is that separation between nature and culture. By nature, I mean the plants, animals, and the features and products of the earth itself. Humans and the things humans create are always in opposition to nature when we look at Minas Tirith. The city itself seems like it was pushed by nature onto the side of the mountain. The residents of the city are walled in by layers of defensive rings, almost like they are protecting themselves from nature. Besides the wall of Minas Tirith, the city itself is kept away from nature by the mountains in the south and the valleys of Losanak that have been tamed into farmland but are still mostly forested. This kind of separation from nature would not make sense to most Africans, just like it wouldn't make sense to Native Americans. In African mythology, humans come from nature, either from the clouds, or germinate from seeds, or spring forth from the reeds. But in The Lord of the Rings, nature is created for the children of Ainur. The humans and the elves don't come from nature, but are placed into nature. In C.S. Lewis' stories, Aslan creates Narnia, but humans come from outside into it. There is that separation of human culture and nature, or the landscape. Your African fantasy characters should have a culture that matches the landscape. Culture is defined generally as a system of shared beliefs, customs, behaviors, and material objects that members of a society use to cope with the world and with one another. Humans can use nature positively or negatively depending on their culture. A culture that extracts value from nature and constantly creates using nature ends up overgrazing, polluting, and cutting trees. A few African cultures do exploit nature through overgrazing and hunting and agriculture, but a significant number tend to view nature as sacred. Nature is our partner in the journey of life. For example, traditional medicine men spend years studying how animals consume medicinal herbs. Trees such as the baobab are seen as sacred in most of the African continent. Livestock is more than just a source of food, but also a blessing from the gods. Sighting of certain animals can either be a predictor of doom or good fortune. When your African fantasy story matches the landscape, it becomes authentic, not just to people familiar with African landscapes, but also to people whom you are introducing to those landscapes. You cannot set your fantasy in a boreal forest when your protagonist is an African pastoralist nomad who lives in tents for most of your fantasy story. How will he survive the cold? How will his cattle survive the cold? You can't set your story in the savannah plains and have one of your characters talk about having survived a bear attack. How would he have encountered a bear in Africa? Instead, your character should lament about encountering hyenas, lions, snakes, or even buffalo. You see how a landscape can change your story? Of course, with fantasy, you can create any world you like, but your readers need to believe that the landscape you chose is real. So, what do you think? Discuss this in the comments below. And don't forget to leave a like because it helps with YouTube algorithms. That is all I have for today. Goodbye and good luck.